Just there and then it's Nice. Can we start? Okay, then good afternoon to everybody. We are going to have this event in a sort of hybrid format. So most of the speakers are here, but most of the audience is actually connected online. So I have to say it's the first time I have such a format. So maybe I'm not used to that yet. So the event of today is part of the initiative within the Florence School of Banking and Finance called Women in Finance. And the particular topic of today's event is going to be private and public gender inclusiveness in decision-making positions, why and how. And I'm very happy that we have organized this event, and we have 4 speakers that I would like to introduce in alphabetical order, actually. The first one is Joanna Gauthier-Morin, who is a research fellow here at the UI and is part of an ERC project called EcoInt. Then we have Costanza Hermanin, who is instead a research fellow at the School of Transactional Governance here at the UI. And then we have 2 external speakers that I don't see online yet. I see their names, but not their faces. And they are, okay, now I see them, one and the other, okay, now we are all here. So Brenna Hugas-Negaev, and forgive me for the pronunciation, and Tom Sims, both from Reuters. And what we are planning to do is to have an initial part on each of the speakers, actually the 2 Reuters together. So we sort of have 3 presentations 3 individual presentations with discussions, and then we will reconvene in a more general panel discussion where we'll be discussing all together topics related to women and career of women. So the nice thing is that we are going to see the topic of women in finance and participation of women in 3 distinct, if you want, areas. So we start with the Reuters, with Brenna and the team, and Tom, sorry, on the private sector. So are European banks still living in a man's world? Then we are going to have a Costanza that is going instead to talk about, does inclusive political leadership deliver more sustainable governance? So we will go to the public sector if you want. And then we will finish with Joanna talking about women leadership is no longer a surprise, the rise of women in international financial institutions. So we will take a sort of historical view as to why we need or what is the role that women may have in international institutions, and therefore why should we care about diversity, if that is the right question to ask. So let's start with Brenna and Tom. I don't know how you're going to share the presentation, but the floor is yours, and we are going to have half an hour with your presentation, and then first a Q&A, and then we move to the other presentations as well. And thank you again for participating.
Hi, thank you so much for having us. We're really delighted to be here. I'm just going to get this presentation up and running and then share my screen quickly. Okay. All right. Okay. I hope that's working now. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes. And I should have said before you start, Brenna, that we have a number of people connected online, and please, the participant, feel free to intervene and ask a question through the Q&A box in the Zoom link. Please, Brenna.
Okay, all right. Hi, everybody. My name is Brenna Hughes-Nagaiwi. I report on finance and especially the Swiss banks for Reuters out of Zurich. And presenting with me here today is my colleague, Tom Sims, who's going to introduce himself now.
Yeah, hi, I'm Tom Sims. I'm also a journalist with Reuters. I'm based in Frankfurt, Germany, and write about German finance, big banks, insurance companies, regulation, crime, that sort of thing.
Okay, and what we're going to be talking to you today about is the findings from a deep dive we did into gender diversity at the top of Europe's big banks. Which we published on International Women's Day in March this year. So the genesis for this reporting really occurred over one weekend last November when 2 major events happened on our patch. I'm going to hand over to Tom to speak about his part.
Yeah, I remember well. It was Friday evening, just before 9 in Frankfurt. In fact, my pizza had just been delivered when suddenly the moment came that many of us business journalists in Germany had been waiting for, the naming of a new chair at Deutsche Bank, which of course is the largest bank in Europe's largest economy. And the nominee for this job was, you guessed it, a man. And it was just hours later that something similar happened back in Zurich, right, Brenna?
Right, yes. So it was actually a Saturday afternoon, and similarly, I was at a birthday party, my mother's birthday party, when I got very many calls on my phone asking me to leave that party immediately. And it was UBS, which is the world's largest wealth manager and Switzerland's biggest bank, also announcing a new chair. And here we are going to see the 2 nominees. So as you can see, we went from 2 men to two other men for these positions. And actually there was some talk that these were diverse hires because we had one Irishman and one Dutchman hired for these jobs. And there's some sense that hiring somebody who's outside of, not a Swiss national or not a German national is already diverse for this. But in the broader scheme, you could say that obviously there was no change of gender, and otherwise maybe diversity was a little bit limited in these hires. And so the question came from our editor pretty quickly, which was, well, were there any women in the running for these jobs? And maybe Tom can talk about what he found out for Deutsche Bank.
Yeah, so at Deutsche Bank, the chairman, Paul Achleitner, the previous chairman, announced that he would retire. The search for a successor was followed very closely by us at Reuters and all of our competing news organizations. For months, 3 names were floated as possible successors. All of them were men who were already sitting on the supervisory board. A woman, Mary Clark, a former Morgan Stanley banker on Deutsche Bank's supervisory board, was given the task of overseeing the search for a replacement. She's publicly advocated for female causes, yet the job went in the end to an outsider, a complete surprise, this 4th person, the Dutchman, Alexander Vinents. So no serious contender was on the list who was a woman, as far as we can tell.
Right. And in the case of UBS, you also had quite a few names that had been floated. I mean, again, these were orderly succession plannings. These weren't, there were no surprises that a new hire was made. So there was a lot of speculation beforehand. And all the names, again, that were floated, well, they weren't all UBS insiders. They were men, and quite a few men in the Swiss banking establishment. This name, again, it was a surprise, wasn't on the list of expected nominees, but nonetheless, this was a man. And so basically from that, we decided to look into the hiring process and who really, were there any women on the list? And on the side of UBS, the sort of, we spoke to various sides of the process of finding people, and the sense was that yes, there it would have been nice to hire a woman, but for various reasons, either there was no, whether it was that there wasn't a suitable female candidate or not an available candidate. The thinking was that it wasn't a surprise the job went to a man. So basically, we didn't want to stop there, and we thought, and also with some input from our editor at the time, Rachel Armstrong, well, there's been quite a bit of turnover. I mean, on my patch, I'd seen changes at Credit Suisse as well over this time, and we thought, well, let's look at what's happened more broadly at European banks at the chair and CEO level over the last 2 years, where we saw major movements, social movements, which put more emphasis on diversity. And so we looked through the top 25 banks. We found that over the course of this 2-year period of early 2020 to late 2021, there had been, in fact, 22 changes implemented or announced. So that's nearly half the chair and CEO jobs which changed. And this is what the picture looked like at the end of that period. So this is what you see on this slide are the heads of Europe's 25 biggest banks, both the chairs and the CEOs. And as you can see, we have 49 men, because one of the jobs is actually a co-shared, and 3 women. So 2 female chairs and 1 female CEO. And basically from that, we thought, okay, well, this, proportionally, we can see at the very top, we don't see a lot of gender diversity, but how does that look more broadly on the board level and on the executive or top management level? So we did a deep dive into analyzing that data. And what we found was that at the board level, you had, almost all the banks have at least 1/3 gender diversity on their board of directors. Since early 2020, that proportion had come up a little, but from a higher level. Whereas when you looked at the executive management level, you have, there's a lot of diversity in terms of, the top banks having 50% or 40% and above, and the lowest performer having, out of 18 top managers, 1 single woman. And I'm gonna hand over to Tom to discuss how we saw that comparing to banks abroad.
Yeah, so we wanted to have some sort of international comparison. So we looked at the U.S. banks, or a handful of the U.S. banks, and specifically we looked at these so-called GSIBs, the global systemically important banks. There are 8 of them in the United States. It's not a perfect comparison, but covers a large portion of the US banking industry. So what can we see? Well, on the whole, on average, executive or management representation by women is at a higher level in the United States than at the European banks. It's 30% for the United States and 25% for European banks. So a 5 percentage point gap there. Only 7 of the top 25 European banks are above that 30% level. None of the US banks are at the lower end of the spectrum of the European banks. All are over 20%. But what you can also see, there is quite a bit of divergence at the US institutions, and not everything went in the direction of more female representation. As you can see, JP Morgan and Bank of America slid over this 2-year period that we're measuring. In terms of boards of directors or supervisory boards, the US was lagging 2 years ago, but has now caught up with Europe in that regard. And I have to say, we didn't ever really get a satisfactory explanation on why the US banks are 5 percentage points ahead in terms of female representation. So
Right.
That's what I wanted to say about that.
Are we moving on to the next
Yeah,
slide?
let's move to the next one.
Okay.
So yeah, we had a lot of good conversations with people and institutions out there when we were researching this, and one of them was with Boston Consulting. And the slide that you see right now is directly from Boston Consulting. We copy and pasted it. They also looked into this issue, and this is a slide from a report they did in December. And one of the interesting things that really stood out to us was that involves pay. So yes, we see more women on supervisory boards than in the past, but according to Boston Consulting, if you look at the pay of those women on those boards, at 80% of the banks, the women earn less than men on average. And that, they say, is an automatic reflection of the fact that women are not chairing those boards, and that women may not be as well represented on the relevant committees that earn more compared to men. And it may also reflect the fact that many of the female board members are board representing employees, so from the employee side rather than from the investor side, which would affect the pay. And the other point that just kind of really worth making from their study is that the whole portfolio of European banks is not homogeneous. There are some banks which are doing really great on this front, and others that are still pure boys clubs. And based on our conversations with Boston Consulting, there's sort of two, they look at it like this, there are two camps of banks. There's some that really just sort of look at this as from a client compliance point of view, doing just what's necessary, and sort of had this attitude of, we have one woman on the board and we are done. And that's where they leave it at that. And then there's this other group of banks which see it more as a competitive advantage to promote women and feel some conviction.
Right. And that also is reflected in the fact that, you know, across the board, you see banks doing pretty well or good enough on the side of the board of directors. And as we had that explained to us, across most of Europe, you do have either regulatory or legal standards in place which set a floor of female representation. Whereas on the executive, and also shareholders, you know, are more and more concerned about this issue, and they have votes to make at annual general meetings. And therefore, there's a lot of outside pressure to do well on the supervisory or board of directors level, whereas that same pressure isn't yet there, or isn't there in most places on the executive management side. So this brings us to the why. Obviously, you know, when we had all this data, we had dozens of conversations with, you know, from policymakers, regulators, to banking executives, board members, headhunters, shareholders, just different sides of this, you know, of the picture, to find out, well, what's really holding European banks back on the executive board level, and why also do you see such a divergence of some really having gotten up to 50%, and some being as low as 5.6 on the executive side. And maybe Tom wants to start with some of the conversations he had.
Yeah, so you know, we had a lot of great conversations for this, but one that really stood out for us was the head of diversity, the former head of diversity of BNP Paribas in Belgium, who now does similar work for a Belgian financial sector lobby. And she said it's really biased more than anything else. And she put it so well when she described what happens when a CEO named something like Tim, for example, leaves the job. She said, Tim goes away. So who looks like Tim? It's usually not a Sarah. And so she said that as soon as you have visible role models at the company, at the bank, this sort of gender bias starts to wither away. But one problem that she pointed out is that most banks don't seem to know how many or where their glass ceilings are. And most banks, she said, believe that they have just one glass ceiling and that it's just below the level of senior management. But when they look a little bit more closely, they realize that there are actually 2 or 3 glass ceilings instead of one, and that they really start to lose women in the middle of middle management. So she was urging that banks really look and study closely where these glass ceilings are.
Right. And I think what the conversations really cemented over what we heard a lot in so many conversations is that it really comes down to culture, that shareholder pressure and regulation can be important to, making those first changes. But overall, what really needs to happen is that there needs to be a cultural shift in mindset. What one headhunter explained is that there's so many institutions that have technical rule books in place, which are supposed to be supportive of women, whether it's allowing for certain leaves of absences, against discrimination, or other things like this. But that people who actually work in those organizations say that, in fact, when they speak to their managers, when they speak to their colleagues, that's not part of the culture, that actually accessing or adhering to those policies isn't something that's really lived in everyday life. And that ultimately, if you have a technical rule book in place, but it's not felt throughout the culture, then it just becomes lip service. And there were many women. We spoke to quite a few women who were in senior management positions, who'd done very well also in quite earlier in their careers, who rose to high levels where they were the first or only women who'd made it to that level at that point in time. And again, these women spoke about the changes that were required in terms of their behavior. One woman talked about a key to her success being a sort of cultural program that, a women's leadership program she attended, which taught her, you shouldn't connect or network in the way that you're used to. You shouldn't use complimenting as a way to form connections, but rather, do banter or sit in a certain way, because that's the male culture. And I think one of the wishes that was expressed is that as you see more women reaching these higher levels, as and in the end, while the executive management level is still, far below, it's only 1 in 4 across the board that are female at this point, it is increasing. And the hope is that as you see that increase, you can get a cultural shift where it's not just women being asked to take on, these sort of male characteristics, but the culture shifting to a place which allows everyone to sort of present as they are. Which leads us to our final slide. Is it changing? And I think we've got a few examples for this. So one is that, of course, our report was published in March. So we followed up a little to see, what's changed since we compiled that data. And we still saw this sort of divergence, that you saw some institutions making changes, significant changes. Barclays, which had a change of CEO, a diverse hire or promotion back in November 2021, not a female, but a candidate of diversity. And they have made 3 changes since our report was published. 2 on the board level and 1 on the executive management level for a chief finance position. And those hires were all women, which shows this is an organization that is changing at this point. I think Tom had one to talk about as well.
Yeah, so by contrast, I'll harp on Deutsche Bank because that's I can see them out the window here. They announced, they basically promoted the CFO to a deputy CEO role some weeks ago. The head of its asset management group got involved in some sort of scandal involving greenwashing and stepped down, and the person to replace him was a man, and then the person to replace him was a man. So we've seen a bit going on there. Deutsche Bank, I would just add, they are working on increasing female leadership. They have a program in place to increase female leadership to 35% of their ranks by the year 2025. They did miss a previous goal that they'd set. The CEO just yesterday at a separate conference in Italy said that during his many years at Deutsche Bank that they've made big progress on that front.
Right. And the last example we want to give with a hopeful message of how quickly change can happen. This isn't one that has announced any executive changes recently, but did unveil a program to increase representation of women at the management level. And that's UniCredit, an institution I'm sure is very familiar to you all. And this, if we go back a little bit, that lender by far made the biggest changes over a 2-year period of going from 4% female representation on the top management level to 40%. And that was also a change that happened under new leadership. So we do see examples that, having, and I think we have someone who would be very well placed to speak about that as well with us. It seems that, when lenders make this a priority, you can see changes and they can be significant. And we're starting to see some of those. So that was all for our presentation. Thank you so much for listening. And we have our contact details. We'd of course be happy at any point to hear from any of you, discuss anything. We're as journalists, we're always open to connecting and hearing from you.
Thank you, Brenna. Thank you, Tom. This was, to me, I've followed your article, as you know. We even talk about the case of UniCredit at the time when you wrote the article, and this is why we got in touch. But this, I have to say, was a very insightful presentation in many dimensions. If I can think about the many things you said, and I want to come back to some of them at least now, and then we will have more time later. One of the things you talk about, it seems to me at least as an optimist message, that there has been, although with divergence, we have seen an increase of women representation. I think it's fair to say you looked at 2 years ago relative to now, but I think if we extended the period, we would see even more probably improvement across the whole system then. So I think that is a positive message. And over the weekend here, we had a training with the European Banking Authority representative, and they were showing us, for example, graphs of board representation of women, and you can see that the board representation of women, in particular, if we look at the age composition, women are younger on average, and there was a big increase of gender representation depending on the years of board members. This is to say that I hope that your lack of women appointments in the CEO and chairperson, we will see changes in the future, even on those very high positions, because indeed there is a positive trend in the representation of women, both in the executive level, but even more because of obvious reason in the board composition. So I think I do hope that, the younger generations will have, Joanna, for example, here is significantly younger, for example, than I am. I hope that in her generation, we will not be even talking about this in 10, 20 years time. That would be my biggest wish if I had to express one. Now, you said a number of things that are very important. One, for example, is the fact of different pay for board members when they are female. Now, I like to think about gender gap in salary for equal position. But here, what you presented to us is that indeed women did not have the same position in the board as men. And that's the reason why the difference pay. But at least in the board, it's fair to say there is no gender gap, because if you have the same role, for the same role, you are paid the same. And that is very different from gender gap in terms of salary for the executive, where maybe you have also for the same role, you may have very big divergences in salaries between men and female. So I think we need to distinguish that. Having said that, it's clear that your observation that the women do not have the same position in boards as men is important in itself. So it's not just a matter of different pay, but it's a matter of why don't they have the same position. And in that, I would like to share actually a curiosity. As a chair of the risk committee of UniCredit, we have a sort of network with the chairs of risk committee in other banks. And the other day, we had a call with chairs of the risk committee of Deutsche Bank, so Marie Clark, that you mentioned before, Deutsche Bank, Santander, Nordea, Barclays, and UniCredit. And funny to say, there was only one man on the call. And actually, there was the chair of the risk committee of Barclays. And he started the conversation by saying, it's the first time I am in a call about risk with only women. So, and the chairs of the risk committee, I think it's fair to say, after the chairperson of the board, is probably the most important position. So this is another wish to say that some of these women, including Marida, is the chair of the risk committee of Deutsche Bank, will become chair of the bank in an ordinary succession plan, as you have described before. So again, there I hope is a message of optimism, both for female representation in boards, in numbers, in position. So many of them are now the chairs of the risk committee. BNP Paribas also now has a female as a chair of the risk committee. So I mean, things are changing, and they're changing also within boards for the same number of women. So that is, I think it's very important. Another aspect you touched, and I think is also very important, is how do you make this change? And as you observed, and I fully in alignment with you, it's easier and faster to have the change when we have a change in the leadership. So UniCredit was a clear example. You mentioned Tom at Barclays, that also was an example. So this is, I think, indeed, if you do have a new CEO or a new chairman, even if they're men, that are very committed to gender issues and also get along well with women, because not all men get along with women and vice versa. I think that's another aspect that certainly facilitate and fasten the transition. That is certainly another observation. One other aspect, and this is more a question than a comment, on the culture that you said, it's fair to say in many boards have changed because of quotas. Some now are very well above quotas, in UniCredit, for example. But quotas are for board position and they're not for executives. So the question that I have for you is, would you see a rationale or a reason to have quotas also among the executives? It's of course much more delicate to have quotas there, because of course, of course, an issue of do we have enough quality in women to get those positions? But do you see that quotas may help, or do you think they wouldn't be useful in the executive roles?
So I guess I could share the thoughts that I've seen from sort of the people we've talked to, which is that it seems to me that, quotas clearly can play an important role in getting the ball rolling. I know they're very hotly debated, and there's the question of, well, should you even need quotas to get there? Is it going to be an issue of, just something that's pro forma? But I think what we see on the executive management level is that you do have this big divergence where some institutions are really on board, and some are not. And perhaps it's possible, especially when you're looking at a range of sizes of institutions, that divergence will persist. I mean, one example we can have in Switzerland of not from, this is not from banking, but just in terms of the overall voting, that Switzerland implemented female suffrage at an extremely late point in time. Early 70s on the federal level, was one of the last countries to do so. And then most of the cantons or regions sort of, had followed suit. But actually in the year 1990, you still had one canton, one region, where of course it's just the men voting. And on the regional level, they still voted against giving women the vote. So, quite a late time. And there was no indication that they were going to change that position until it was ultimately ruled on, a level outside of their political scope that they had to make that change. And so you had a female voting implemented in up until in the early 90s, not because they voted to make that change, but because it was imposed on the male voting population. And I think, there is some move on the executive level as well. So Switzerland has a soft quota, so a non-binding quota of 20% on the executive management level from 2031 onwards. So that means you're not actually facing consequences if you don't get there, but there's a sign that over, this next decade, the expectation is for companies to get to that place, and that there will be scrutiny, and they will need to publish something saying why they're not there if they don't.
But that means somehow that we are going to see more and more shareholders pressure, also not just for the boards, but also for for gender representation at the executive level. So another aspect is the ESG movement, the G in particular. Maybe that can play a role in trying to foster more pressure in having more female executives. Okay. Okay, let me first encourage again the audience that is following us online to ask a question if they like. And instead, unless Costanza or Joanna have a question for Tom and Brenna, do you have a question? Yeah, okay. Joanna?
I have a small question, because then the biggest question can be discussed in the panel discussion. But you mentioned the fact that in most of the banks you studied, you looked at, there were women leadership programs to train women maybe accessing more leadership attitude. Or have you ever heard of the same kind of programs but for men, actually? Because if you mention the need to have a cultural shift, then the men must be trained to accept women leadership at some point, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's the fact that there's no easy answer maybe is already an answer to some extent. That, I guess just sort of internally, we also have, I don't know, Tom, if you've attended these, but we've had some breaking bias webinars, things like this. But I've heard much more from women about, I was told to not cross my legs and, to sit with this, not just at the management level, by the way, but also lower, that, I need to put my arms like this, and I didn't know how to do it, much more than I've heard from men that they were told, you know, I need to sit like this or speak in this way, and it was kind of an adjustment for me. But I'm not sure. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're not there. Maybe it's also a condition of what stays with people or what sorts of conversations I've had. I don't know about you, Tom.
Yeah. So I just wanted to go back to this point we talked about a few seconds ago about the mandating and quotas. I just wanted to mention that in Germany also very recently there are quotas for management boards that have been enacted, but it only affects something like 66 companies. And if you're sort of interested in that, the German think tank DIW has put together a really helpful chart, and so you can see how Germany, this new program would only affect 66 companies, whereas similar measures affect something like 5,000 companies.
Okay, there is a question, how would you measure change beyond numbers? But let me postpone this question to when we go to the panel, because I think we can discuss that across both the public and the private sector, not just the private sector. So let me stop here for a moment with Tom and Brenna. Thank you very much again for this interesting intervention. Now stay connected, because we will then have a panel later. But now we move to Costanza, who will bring us instead in the area of public sectors and politicians. And let's see how is the situation there. Costanza, please.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. Just let me start by saying, following up on the conversation, that last year, after 10 years, the European institutions found an agreement on compulsory quota on boards of European companies. So we are likely to have pan-EU legislation on that. Probably we can discuss this later. So let me start by thanking you again. My name is Costanza Hermanin, and I'm a research fellow at the School of Transnational Governance, where I am leading a project that is actually called Inclusive Leadership for Sustainable Governance. And the question that I'm going to address here today is, does inclusive political leadership deliver more sustainable governance? And in short, in my view, more inclusive, gender inclusive political leadership does deliver more sustainable governance. And here I would like to discuss with you why and how, basically. So let's start with politics. Elizabeth Borne, just less than 1 month ago, was named as the second woman prime minister in France. The person before held a very short term 20 years ago. And maybe she's likely to hold a very short term as well, given that next week we have legislative elections and it's not certain that she will keep her post. But having said that, there are other political nominations there have been recently that seem to signal that the trend of having few women in power, just as we were saying now, is changing also in the political domain and in financial institutions, especially, with the new head of the World Trade Organization, the US Treasury, International Monetary Fund, and the European Central Bank. And at most, at the political level, we are all seeing, everybody is talking about the nomination not only of Ursula von der Leyen, but also of Roberta Metsola, more recently, the long tenure of Angela Merkel, and on the other side of the world, Jacinda Ardern's election. So are these signs of the fact that also in political leadership, we are making a lot of progress, where they are important signs because they're very visible. But in terms of number, I want to show you something, and I'll start my screen, sharing my screen now. Sorry if I haven't done it before. You should be able to see this now. Yes, you are. And the first slide is something that you probably know. Is the Global Gender Gap Index. This is an index compiled by the World Economic Forum. So a forum, a group of people engaged in finance and in banking, and to some extent. And I think we should start by asking ourselves why the most authoritative gender equality index in the world is compiled by a group of people engaged in finance and banking. And the reason why I'm showing you this one is that we all know that gender equality is far from being achieved across different dimensions. What we don't know is that in politics is the least gender equal field. So if we have gender equality across education, health, economics, and politics, which is at a level of around 70% achieved, in politics is only 22% achieved. And this takes into account of prime minister, women legislators, time of women prime ministers in office. We were talking about the French ladies before, and so on and so forth. If you look at economic participation and opportunity sub-index, which takes into account what we were just discussing, you see that is more than double. So politics is a problematic dimension. And what I was saying before, I mean, we have all these prominent, important nominations, but if we look at the hard data, these are the hard data we have nowadays. The number of countries where the de facto highest position of executive power was held by a woman from 1960 to 2022 is this graph. And mind, the numbers are not percentages, they're absolute numbers. So in 2022, we are talking about 15 top executive political position. So either president, where president has an executive function, like in presidentialism or semi-presidentialism, or head of state. It means that less than 10% of the head of states or government are women. So we can think that there is a lot of improvement given all the, some prominent nominations that have been done recently, but also in the EU at the moment, we have only slightly more than 10% women prime minister here. And they are all placed in the Nordic countries with the exception of one, which is placed in Eastern Europe. So, but let's leave this level. Everybody knows this level. Just a few more data. So take Germany. Do you know how many Bürgermeisterinnen are there in Germany out of 11,000 municipalities? It's 9%, 9%, less than 10%. It's slightly better in Italy, 14%, but the mayors who have been named, just elected last Sunday, they are 16 men, okay? And France's share is 20%. Of mayors, and I could go ahead and so forth, but if you know the German Bundesländer, you know that 2/3, more than 2/3 are held by men in spite of very recent elections. So the data are what they are, and we shouldn't be thinking that there is a substantive change ongoing yet. But let's go a little bit more into some arguments rather than descriptive data. So we saw that there is some progress, but it's not very noticeable. The question of this panel were two: why should there be more women leaders in politics and elsewhere, and how? So I wanted to address this, make some consideration, but also I would like to arrive on the how, to an end which connects a little bit with the Florence School of Banking and Finance, because I want to talk about also methods of governance. Sustainable governance is also about methods, and therefore what is nowadays called gender impact analysis and gender budgeting, and maybe ask you a question about criteria for finance. and this is a question for me, it's not an affirmation, I'm not a specialist there, but I have ideas. So why should there be more women in power in politics? And in politics, even more than in the financial sectors. Even so, mind, quotas exist only in politics and on company boards. It's the only quota legislation that exists worldwide. So we should make a comparison there. Well, the first of all is that it is only fair to have more women. I saw, one event of the Women in Finance series where Sylvie Goulart was saying, if half of the mankind is not represented in certain positions of power, it means that selection procedures are not meritocratic, they are flawed. And it's just statistics, right? So I think she's totally right. And some research that is being done, for instance, by Paola Profeta in Milan, this piece shows that when there is more competition of women for leadership position, for instance, because there are quotas, then the level of qualifications, in this case, academic qualification of elected politicians goes up because competition increases and women are asked to be competent there. But this is not only the most important point. Fairness, parity, democracy, social justice arguments are not the only important point. Perhaps the most important point is that having more women in leadership position maybe can deliver better policy making, policies that are more sustainable to achieve the aim, which is the aim for which women leaders are just an instrument. And the aim is having a more equal society, well-being better distributed, right? So that's the most important thing. And this is why I focus on this idea that inclusive leadership is a matter of who is in power, but also how they exercise power in a more horizontal way, in a more cohesive way, in engaging in risk assessment and taking less risk, and all a series of factors that maybe I will detail a little bit more in order, and that these can deliver more sustainable policies and specific sets of policies. So inclusive leadership is a concept that is already being conceptualized in organizational theory and in social psychology. It's a way of leading that is different from the traditional political and economic leadership style that is called transactional, okay? I give you something, you give me something back, you receive transaction, and then we all gain something and we achieve or we keep power through that. The thesis here is that having more women or more diverse leadership would change this leadership style. And why? Well, this is because of gender stereotypes to a large extent. Gender stereotypes through which we live and we carry at the moment in time. And obviously we are more conscious that we carry them, but we cannot do anything else but carrying them. So yes, women are less conflictual when they are in power. Yes, women have different policy priorities. But this is not because it's innate. This is not because they're women. This is because there have been centuries and even millennia of having women occupy certain positions and dialogue in a certain way and caring about people and environment first. And this is the connection in between inclusive leadership, more women, and sustainable governance, caring about people and environment first. It's about reproducing gender constructed role, which are there, and which is absolutely, in my view, important to deconstruct, okay? But since we haven't deconstructed them well, let's take the most of it and use this preference that women have for policies related to education, social justice, social inclusion, and environment in order to change the way of doing politics and change priorities in a context like the present context where health crisis, environmental transition, demographic bumps, and aging on the other end. And many of these different phenomena have become crucial and need to be addressed in as much as economic growth. So this is what I intend when I talk about inclusive leadership as who is in power and how they decide, and sustainable governance in terms of policy priorities on the one hand and policy method on the other hand. And this policy method brings me to the second part of the presentation. Just to say, the sustainable governance, let's say, terminology is not that I've invented it. You know probably very well that there is a sustainable governance index that is managed or published by the Merzelmans Stiftung according to goals that have been adopted by the OECD like 20 years ago. So it's nothing new, and my research is in the framework of that conceptualization. Now, is there any evidence and research that having more women in power has an impact on policymaking? There is little. And why? Because there have been very little women in power. So there is some, especially on developing countries, currently the parliament where there are more women and the government is Rwanda. So, you know, there is research on developing countries show that women's political priorities and budget spending are within education and health, and this has effects, concrete effects on policy outcome. But there is little, for instance, on economic performance. There is, to my knowledge, I mean, very few papers beyond the work of Bhaskaran and Balotra on India. And it's not by chance that it is on India, because the Indian subcontinent is the continent that has had most women leading for more time. So, I mean, they have some historic data to do this kind of assessment of economic performance of having more women leader. So there is incipient research on that, and you must have seen this in the context of COVID. Have women leaders taken better decisions of COVID? And there has been some research about it, and some sound qualitative and quantitative research, the outcome of some being women are less risk averse, so they've closed their countries earlier and they have avoided more deaths. Economic performance has gone down first, but it will come up more rapidly later because they have preserved their population. This was the outcome of some research. On the other hand, there were very quantitative guys that were saying, come on, you have 15 cases over 193. How is this significant when you analyze COVID response? And they are right as well. So some researchers is there, but is limited. Certainly there are differences that are noticeable. And according to me, these differences are, as I was mentioning before, derived from constructed gender roles. But there is another thing that people frequently ask. Do women leaders adopt policies for women? And is this relevant for us? The answer is yes and no. There are some leaders who do openly and some others who didn't. I don't think you can think of Maggie Thatcher or Angela Merkel as leaders who have been adopting policies for women consistently or revendicating policies for women. So it really depends on who is in power. And yet some examples that I want to give to you are important because the adoption of this policy can really support in some way the end goal that we are looking at through having more women in position of powers, which is having more equitable and sustainable society. First, let's see something. We have been discussing about quotas. Normally, people, I mean, the entire debate about women in power is about are quotas good or not? Certainly they are not enough. This is the chart of where quotas are being implemented. It's most of the world. more countries have quotas than countries that do not have quotas, okay? Different kind of quotas, we can go back here later. And yet you saw the executives, this is the progress in parliamentary seats worldwide, the average is 25%. The executives haven't changed that much. So I would say, okay, interesting, but it's not changing that much. Probably what can change more is adopting different methods of governance. And here I come to the last 2 points of conclusion. Now, since we have had Ursula von der Leyen at the head of the Commission, and I also must say Céline Gauer at the head of the Recovery and Resilience Task Force last year, we had a meeting 2 days ago. There have been a set of instruments that have been adopted at the EU level, which have to do with ways of making and monitoring policies that, according to me, do a lot more for gender inclusion than simply implementing quotas. And our very institutions have been experimenting this, because nowadays, in order to access Horizon Europe, if you don't have a gender equality plan, you cannot even ask for funds, okay? And this is gender conditionality in policymaking that has been implemented over the past 1.5 years. It's not only there. I just want to list a few things, okay? Instruments that can help achieve a more gender inclusive society, and therefore also, I mean, this is our last end, but a more gender inclusive society can also express more leaders, right? So just to give an example of the last 3 years. So the Commission has adopted in the interinstitutional agreement on the multi-annual financial framework some obligations in terms of gender impact assessment and gender budgeting methods. And this has gone most notably in the common provisions regulation for shared management funds, structural funds, which means that Commission and member states will have to monitor the ex-ante situation vis-a-vis gender equality and the ex-post situation vis-a-vis gender equality of implementing EU money, of spending EU money and implementing projects. There is the similar program in the TSI regulation, the technical support instrument supports this kind of reforms and monitoring. The Next Generation EU package and the regulation on recovery and resilience facilities imposes to states to collect gender data and do gender impact assessment and gender budgeting. The Commission issued guidelines for drafting national recovery and resilience plans, and it also adopted an own scoreboard based on the OECD scoreboard, but it's improved in order to screen spending programs. And very importantly, and a little bit connected with what we discussed this morning, it is also promoting a do no harm approach, similar to the one used for environment, meaning that money is important in this process. People who are in power are implementing a method of governance that looks at how money impacts on gender differences in the various sectors. This is being ringing around the fact that member states are now implementing gender procurement criteria because they need to make sure that they know how the money is spent and who spends the money and who benefits from the money in order to report to Brussels. And we as universities will have to do the same. Gender labeling. So companies are taking these labels in order to be able to access funds, okay? So there is increasing transparency rule, for instance, on pay transparency. And I think that the association of this method, the consistent adoption of this method can be way more powerful, the hold the money method, than only acting on who goes into leadership. But we have to admit that this method, who has been there for 30 years, mainly implemented at the local level, had not yet been adopted at the EU level before the arrival of a consistent amount of women politicians at the EU level, And also we have to admit, before the impact of COVID, that has mainly impacted on women employment. So we need to monitor how we spend funds also, because there are more women who are without a job. Conclusion. My conclusion is a question for you. Is there a role for private finance in the quest for more gender equality? Something I raised at the Rome Investment Forum in December, but finance is not in any gender equality strategy of the EU. And yet this morning we heard from different speakers, Marcel Haag more specifically, that in the ESG criteria for finance, the S is social sustainability and should contain, obviously, also a gender dimension, because the main dimension of social sustainability is first subgroups that are at risk of poverty. So it was said this morning that the S is not developed at all, and there aren't any instruments on the S that are comparable to the existing instruments on the E, such as the taxonomies, such as the, what was said this morning, the disclosure mechanism, or labels for companies that can benefit from investments. So the question here that I want to place at the very end of this is that there are no plans yet at the EU level for, I don't want to say gender in finance, but including some instruments by which finance can contribute to equality, in spite of having women leaders who have adopted decisions in this sense when it comes to programs and budgets. And maybe I'll ask you, Joanna, later, I mean, given that we have more women in financial institutions, maybe this is a task up for them. I mean, is there a role for this kind of private finance or public regulation of finance in order to contribute to gender equality through the adoption of instruments that are close to the ones we have devised and nowadays adopted for environmental sustainability? Once again, a taxonomy, disclosure, labels, and things like that. Irene Monasterolo this morning said, we need to point out return on investments. Otherwise, these instruments are not to be used, and there's not going to be any success in green finance. In 2020, the Commission estimated that economic loss due to gender employment gap amounted to 370 billion per year in the EU. Okay, the gender employment gap is about 11% in the EU. And that gender equality could lead to an increase in GDP of up to 3.15 trillion by 2050. Is perhaps one of the most powerful volanos for growth. So I really wonder whether investors could see it same way and therefore engage into adhering to some criteria in the realm of sustainable finance that have to do with gender. Thank you. I've been long.
Thank you, Costanza. This was a very enriching, again, and very wide presentation, and we will come back to some of the topics later. But I think, I mean, I'm not a scholar in gender economics or anything related to that, but I'm always a bit perplexed when we started the question by saying, why should we care about gender representation? That, I think, is to me sometimes, and it's a bit of a funny question, because as you said, the 50% of the population is women. So ultimately, are we doing this for fairness, or are we doing this because this improves whatever we're talking about, whether it's the performance of a company, being a private or a public company, whether it's the political system, or whatever it is. And you mentioned this debate you heard in the Women in Finance. I was very surprised that day. I mean, I think you are referring to the one with Sylvie Goulart and Renee Adams. And if you remember, Renee Adams were very vocal on the fact that why should we justify quotas and female representation on the, because that achieves a higher ROE of a company or a higher financial performance. Ultimately, there are other aspects that should be considered that are not just pure economic or financial indicators when considering women representation and women inclusion. So that, I think, I mean, why do we care so much about women representation in political or private? We will hear more with Joanna, but that is always the starting point of the conversation. Why should we have women participating? The other thing you mentioned that I found also very interesting is the difference in the way in which women in leadership, and again, this is a good transition with Joanna, do favor women and do policies for women. And you mentioned Merkel, Thatcher. I wonder to which extent, I mean, to what extent the difference in the way women behavior towards the other is a matter of how many women there are. And I think we touch upon this in various occasions. I very often hear men saying, oh, but women are extremely competitive. Women don't support each other and stuff like that. I have the impression that when there are more women, women become more cooperative, less competitive and so on, because in a way, then it becomes more natural for them to be there and be more accepted by men at the same time. I think this is an issue that we will have to come back. And finally, and now I know that we are running out of time, so I want to go to Joanna, but I'm not sure that I understand fully your final question on finance. What is finance doing for achieving more gender equality? Because ultimately, all the things you talk about budgeting and the reporting, this ex-ante and ex-post measure, in my understanding, they can be considered part of finance already, no? Because anyway, you are monitoring that finance money is spent for either female entrepreneurs or whatever. So maybe in the panel later, you can tell us a little bit more, what is it that these measures are actually doing? And why do you think that there is still need for other financial instruments, as you seem to be saying at the end? But maybe you just want to have a brief talk about this. And Thorsten, please.
Works. Okay, thanks. Fascinating discussion. I have a couple of comments on Constanza. So I would probably not use South Asia as a good example for the power of female leaders, because as you know, they all came to the position because they were either wives or daughters of male. And you have the same actually in Latin America. I mean, Nicaragua, what else? Argentina. I forgot the other example now. So Panama, yes. So that's, I'm not sure what this is, what they, I mean, we want to have independence. So women that do not come to power because of their last name, right? That's the idea. More like a question or a puzzle, and actually Elena might give some insights too. So if you look at the Euro area, you have no female central bank governor, but just out of my head, I can count a handful of female deputy governor. And I also remember, I mean, this is some time ago and it's not the EU, but it was in Albania. I think they had a male central bank governor. When I was there, they actually had 2 female deputy governors. So, I mean, is it just, we have to wait another 10 years until they move up? Or so I'm just curious. Now, finally, on the role of finance, I find that's also very interesting. Now, I've done some research on that, but it's on Africa, it's not on Europe. And what we found there, and we really squeezed and tortured the data until we got some response from it, is that access to finance was actually not the barrier for female entrepreneurship. It was the entry into entrepreneurship, becoming an entrepreneur in the first place. Once you're in there, so you have kind of shown that you're, so to say, or you have overcome the you have overcome the barrier to actually enter entrepreneurship. Then you're kind of on the same level as a man, but it's just harder for women to enter in the first place. But then on the other hand, also coming back to your question, Elena, the role of finance in fostering female board membership, management, and so on. I mean, if there is enough evidence that having, be it a balanced board, balanced management team, or having a female CEO is really helpful, or female CFO is helpful, shouldn't then also the private money follow? I mean, if you believe in markets, of course, they might have to wake up to that kind of insight, but maybe that's the way. Thanks.
I don't know who the question is for, but it's if it is for me, I think this is. I mean, I do believe we need to measure the performance of women in this position, and we need to find a rationale why we should have them. But on the day when we had this Women in Finance with Renee Adams, I was very somehow. I thought that she was a bit excessive in saying we don't need a financial reason to have a women representation. She was very strong on that view. Then I reflected a little bit more upon that. And, you know, yes, maybe it's true that we need to have a financial reason to have a woman, so a better performance reason for that. But is that really necessary in a way? I mean, even if we found, for example, I remember a seminar once in Bocconi where the presenter was saying, we find no difference when we have women. Then what do? Yeah, exactly. So if there is no difference, it's not better, but it's not even worse. Then it comes the fairness point that you were making. And even if we found that women in leadership worsen the performance, but there is another aspect to that, which is the social fairness. So what is the price for social awareness? You know, if we go down that route, maybe Renee that day was not so excessive, or maybe she had a point in claiming, well, my goodness, I think we had a problem with connections. Okay, so maybe it's just us having a problem rather than the connection. Okay. But what I was saying is that maybe she had a point in saying that there is a price that you may want to pay, even financially, for social fairness. So, you know, and yeah, and then we need to go to Joanna, and then we can talk later.
Works. Thanks. There are very in our world, there are very few female finance academics, for example. Economics, it's increasing, of course, but like think back about the beginning of your career. Similarly in economics. Now, if you look at the other side of Europe, it's exactly the opposite. If you go to Central Eastern Europe, the majority is one of the majority, but there are much more women work in economics and finance, which of course has historic reasons related to the communist regime, because economics finance was not seen as the best field. It was left to the women. So, but that is still the case today. And the reason I kind of know this is because I did a couple of studies with Albanian loan officers, and I was always surprised there were more female loan officers than male loan officers, and they were at the beginning of their career. So they came out of university. So it seems to be representative, and ultimately that it turned out to be true. It's not just in the statistics, but then also when I actually was invited to give a talk at the to teach a course at the Bank of Albania, the central bank, there's an extremely high share of females working in finance, including in the central bank. And that must have been kind of a path dependence that comes over several generations. So I think, and that actually, I wonder this might actually speak for quota in certain circumstances to kind of push the representation of females, because they can then set the example for the next generation.
Do you want to say something, Costanza?
Maybe shortly, but I don't know.
Yeah, we are a little bit late with Joanna, so maybe we can also talk about this later in. But just as I think we do need to think about role models, if that is the point you're making, because I mean, being a finance professor female, and I don't mean to say I'm a role model in any form, but I see what this means for younger generation. I live this. I mean, I feel the way women need this for their thinking of their career. But let's go to Joanna now. Let's see a little bit more what women have done in institutional, in particular international organization, and why do we need to care about having them ultimately? Please.
Thank you, Elena. I don't know if the audience online can see my screen, because we don't see you anymore, but okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to reflect on what has been said so far, but from a historical point of view in international organizations. And just to give you a bit of background on this work, I'm part of a team project on 20th century international economic thinking and the complex history of globalization. It's an ERC advanced grant-funded research program directed by Professor Glenda Sluga here, based at the European University Institute. In this program, we look for women international economic thinkers and study the struggles over economic ideas that have fashioned the path to globalization. So its focus is on the generation of those ideas in and through institutional sites, namely intergovernmental organizations and associated international non-governmental organizations. So if we look at the problem of gender inclusiveness in decision-making positions on the long run, international organizations are a great site to look at because they both produce international norms and standards they implement on national levels. And they are also the place where internal struggle, concentrate to advocate for the advancement and the empowerment of women worldwide, starting with the women working in these organizations. So bear with me a bit to follow this intellectual spiral. It is not unusual for a historian to start by the end of the story. So here we go. In 2015, the UN System Staff College launched the Leadership Women and the United Nations program to address the need to ensure women's full and effective participation in the United Nations ecosystem and equal access to leadership opportunities. You can see here on this slide some results of these programs, and you have in the middle all the scribblings here. They're actually the expression, the graphic expression of what the women following this program could write during this program. Some of the stats the program made aimed at highlighting the fact that women sometimes were even more competitive than and had more competencies than men in some aspects, like taking initiatives, learning agility, etc. They are responsible for these results. It's obviously a motivational program, and we can talk about it later, about how we create categories to evaluate on gender basis the competency of workers, but still this does exist. From 2015 to 2022, more than 700 women leaders from across the UN system have followed the program, contributing to the expansion of universal leadership models and a more gender-sensitive and balanced workplace and culture. The title of this talk, Women Leadership is No Longer a Surprise, is a quote from one of the executives of this program after 7 years of implementation. And obviously this can be debated later about is it still a surprise or not. International organizations have come a long way since the earlier 20th century, when women who wanted to join multilateral institutions did not even have the right to vote in their own country. The status of women finally evolved after decades of internal struggle for the recognition of women's rights, more equality, and better representation in international organizations. From the creation of the League of Nations, Article 7 of the Covenant ensured women had the right to work for the League on all levels, including in the Secretariat. However, several women's organizations felt that the League could do more to reach for equality and began a discussion about what role women would play as the organization grew. Women's organizations lobbied to be included in the meetings of the Paris Peace Conference, during which the League of Nations was founded after the end of the First World War. Even after they were granted access to the 12th meeting of the League of Nations Committee, the women were limited to matters which the committee felt had a direct bearing upon women. Nevertheless, the group of women presented the Women's Charter, to which you have the photo of from the archives of the League of the Nations, in which they requested that a woman's nationality be declared independent of her husband, because until then, divorced women who were married with someone from another nation were actually stateless person to give you a sense of where we are coming from. In this charter, they also asked the League to ban the trafficking of women and girls, and they asked that women be afforded the same labor rights as men. Many of the women present at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference would later become involved in the work of the League of Nations, either directly or through women's organizations. But patriarchal gatekeeping mechanisms remained strong for long to exclude women from decision-making positions. There were only 6 women out of the 177 total delegates at the 1922 General Assembly, a figure which climbed to 14 in 1930. And as late as 1936, when 50 countries sent delegations to the League Assembly, there were still only a mere 12 women included. Most women we can find in the League at that time worked in subaltern positions. Here, I want to acknowledge the work of Miriam Piguet, who couldn't be here today, but she's doing her PhD on that specific topic at the University of Geneva, and she's currently visiting at the European University Institute to write in our beautiful villas. But her work shows that 245 women were employed at the League Secretariat in 1925, predominantly working in the central services or as secretaries. You see here the color code of these little figures shows that the job of these women working for the League were mainly subaltern jobs like copyist or shorthand typist, junior assistant, and a few senior assistant. One of the senior assistants, Miss Princess Radziwill, a senior assistant in the information section, wrote a letter to the Secretary General of the League of Nations, Sir Eric Drummond, in 1922, stating, "While in no way protesting against my contract, I would like to renew once more the protest I made against the status of a certain number of women members in the Secretariat, whose work is akin to that of a member of section, and who are grouped under the name of senior assistant. They are treated in a manner which seems to me to be out of proportion to their work when compared with that of other grades in the Secretariat." In her own words, she accused the glass ceiling of impeding women's work to be recognized for what it was. Piguet highlighted in her work, however, how such a discussion in the interwar period marked something entirely new, because at the same period, most national administrations had their higher positions completely closed to women. Now, for those who managed to get there were appointed responsibilities related to what used to be called women's questions, such as women trafficking, prostitution, the fight against alcoholism, that was very important at that time, women's right to education, etc. But the idea that women should be employed in international organizations made its way to the core of the League of Nations and its following institution, the United Nations. At the founding of both the League of Nations and the United Nations, individual women and women's organizations worked tirelessly to ensure women's voices would be well represented in their major organizations. In 1946, the United Nations Economic and Social Council established the Commission on the Status of Women to promote gender equality and women's empowerment worldwide. The Commission gained public attention in 1975 when women delegates proposed to inaugurate the International Women's Year and organized the first World Conference on Women in Mexico City. You can see here on this slide, there's a picture of the very first meeting of women delegates. So if you look closely, there are only women in this room, almost only women. A few of them were maybe the secretaries of the represented. So it was really the first. For the first time in history, women delegates from 133 member states and thousands of representatives of non-governmental organizations convened to establish institutional guidelines for the advancement of women and gender equality. We can even notice that it was the first time that so many NGOs were invited to convene to a UN event, and it was the beginning of a very long story between international organizations and non-government organizations. One of the glaring findings of these 2 weeks of cosmopolitan discussions was the severe lack of macroeconomic knowledge about the exact living conditions of women around the world. Incomplete statistics used by public or private, national or international organizations invisibilize the reality of women's lives. As a result, most policies failed to meet women's need. This is where we enter more the finance aspect and economic aspect of this discussion. This realization led to the creation of the International Research and Training Institute for the Advancement of Women and the United Nations Development Fund for Women. I show you here a few reports published by these two organizations to show you that it corresponds also to the moment when international organizations seize the discussion about sustainable development. It's something that is contemporary to the introduction of more women delegates in these organizations. The fact that women's rights, sustainable development, the fight against poverty are completely linked together because one doesn't go without the other. The fact that women's rights were debated as human rights, which is something that is very new in these debates, and the fact that it became very glamorous all of a sudden to fight for this kind of rights and debates. And you can see here Nicole Kidman with the T-shirt of UNIFEM, just to show you that there is also a social shift about this discussion. In 1988, the first indicators specific to women's conditions, such as maternal mortality, education, and health, were finally included in the general statistics of the World Bank. Why is it so important then to grant women access to decision-making positions? Let's have a look at the marginal influence they have and the intellectual contribution women make to finance and economics in this multilateral context. Indeed, the increasing presence of women international leaders has changed the nature of the debate about financial and economic development in international financial institutions. In the case of the World Bank, for instance, discussions on the role of women in economic development began late. Esther Boserup, that you can see here, we have a picture of Esther Boserup, she wrote her major opus, Women's Role in Economic Development, triggered a slow awakening in 1970. Esther Boserup was a Danish economist who worked at the United Nations, the UN Economic Commission of Europe, and the African Institute for Economic Development and Planning. Her work inspired many changes in international organizations' approach to agrarian reforms and the role of women in development. Under her influence, the World Bank finally opened a position of advisor for women in development in 1977, which set the ground to the inclusion a decade later of these first indicators I was mentioning specific to women's economic conditions in the general statistics of the World Bank. A substantial shift occurred in the 1990s, with increasing attention to poverty and the need to tailor programs to local social realities, culminating in the publication of the Poverty Reduction Strategy papers in 1999. For example, the World Bank's support for education, health, nutrition, and basic social services accounted for less than 6% of its lending in the 1980s, but exceeded 18% in the 1990s. These structural changes were made possible because more and more women were included in decision-making positions. And here, I am sorry, my source was in Spanish. It's one of the reports of the United Nations Secretariat staff. So you can see a smooth, steady increasing in the access to decision-making positions for women in the United Nations Secretariat staff. And then in the 90s, history accelerated. In 1995, the Fourth World Conference on Women held in Beijing welcomed a record of 17,000 women participants and 30,000 activists. It was at this convention that 189 countries and unanimously adopted the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, a blueprint for women's empowerment. The Platform for Action no longer sought to eliminate discrimination against women, but aimed to put women on equal footing with men in all political, economic, educational, civil, and other categories. The United Nations, an entity for gender equality and the empowerment of women, was established in 2010. And finally, in 2018, gender parity was achieved at last in the top leadership of the United Nations. For the first time in history, the cabinet of the Secretary General was comprised equally of men and women. While there has still yet to be a female Secretary General at the United Nations, Amina Mohammed was appointed as the first woman Deputy Secretary General. And I'm going to end on this optimist note for later questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. This is a very positive note in a way. You said 70,000, 70. My goodness. So, and there were only women.
17.
17. Okay. Well, it's still a lot. It's still a lot. Okay. Okay. So let me see here. There is a question here. Maybe we take this question later on to the panel, if it's okay with you. One question that I have on you, though, one observation, I mean, you talk a lot about World Bank, you talk about United Nations. These are, of course, international institutions, and women had specific tasks in a way in these institutions. So the question that I have for you is, why, going back also to Thorsten before, that we have now women in European institutions, but not in the national, for what concerns central banking? Why do we see that somehow we have a first progress in international institution and then eventually comes more the national? Why there is this discrepancy?
It's a great question because it is obviously it depends on the countries, but at the same time, it never depends on the countries because women have less opportunities. They have had less opportunities so far in their national context. So when you have women who are extremely well-educated, they have a lot of skills and they want to have a career, sometimes it's more possible to actually have a career in international organizations. And that's why it was also interesting to point out that at the beginning, women were often assigned women's questions, women's topics. Somehow it was reductive, obviously, to think that women were only able to talk about women's issues, but it also created opportunities for women to enter these kind of organizations because these topics, these issues were not handed to men, but they were handed to women. So women would be in charge of the social welfare, I don't know, division for a while until social welfare became a thing. So it was a man who was appointed, but it created some space. And then once they were in there, they just fought to stay in there. And what is very new in this research, I was mentioning Marianne Piguet because she's really doing something new. She shows that women in the League of Nations were the same after the disparation of this organization, who had the same jobs in the United Nations. They would not go anywhere. They would just stick to international organizations because it was also the only place where they could have a room to actually be and have interesting positions. So somehow in the international level gave more freedom and more opportunities to many women. And then you can see some sort of reverse movement when you have more and more women who have national opportunities in their national context. Then they tend to prefer to have positions in their home country than in international organizations.
They prefer to go to their home country. So once they have given the possibility to go to their home country, that's what they would prefer to do. Do you see that also in the political sphere? Does it occur in the same way?
It's very similar. If you only take the European Union, the European Parliament is the most gender equal parliament across the EU member states. The von der Leyen Commission is among the most gender equal governments in Europe. I mean, in Spain, there have been efforts, no? There has been a 50-50 balance before. I don't think that the present French cabinet is completely balanced. And therefore, at the international level, not only with the latest appointment, but also with gross numbers, there are more women. My interpretation of this is slightly different from Joanna's. Certainly there is a degree of what you were saying, but allow me to say that there is also an issue that members of the European Parliament and commissioners frequently are second-order politicians or going out politicians. So it's not totally surprising that among these, there are more women. So in this case, I think it is a reflection of how the conceptions of leadership and authoritativeness in politics, and where politics is most politician, which is at the member state level where fiscal decisions are taken and social security spending is most important. And you use these instruments to win elections, and you don't do that in Brussels. It's not surprising that at the national level, the scores are lower, according to me.
Torsten? And then we break for a coffee and then we come back. Is still not
Nope.
on? Yeah,
Oh, yes.
now it
Okay.
works.
I have a question. International organization. So I mean, also from my own experience, I observed the same, that it's you get a much larger role for female, also economists in international institutions, and that has been actually the case for quite some time. So I wonder, I mean, coming back to what you mentioned at the beginning, this kind of in versus out, right? You have a room full of men and you're the only woman. In international organizations, and they all, let's say, also go one step further. All the men are from the same university. They all wear gray suits and have the same background. They make the same stupid sports jokes or whatever. In international organization, you don't have that, right? Because you all come from different cultures anyway. So you have to kind of find your spot and your arrangements with your co-workers. Could it be, and I'm just throwing this out there, I'm not sure whether this is right or not, it's there's more kind of space, and even if you're the only woman, you're still, there's one woman, there's maybe also the only French, let's say, there's one only German, one Argentine, they're all kind of minorities that add up to ultimately to the sum. So I'm not sure whether this might also explain some of that then also women have been more successful over time and have in international organization have then also pulled more of them in. Because again, you had somebody, I mean, we all talk about Gita now and Penny Goldberg and so on, Carmen Reinhardt, of course, but even there was even in the 80s, Anne Krüger. I mean, she was deputy managing director at the IMF. So this actually goes back a much longer time. So.
Yes, thank you very much. We mentioned earlier the boys club culture, and I think this is one of the very encouraging thing that international organizations create, is that you can't have this old boys club culture in such an environment. When we interviewed Carmen Reinhardt a few weeks ago, she mentioned diversity calls for more diversity. Obviously, the more diversity you have, the more diversity it's going to create. And ultimately, because international organizations are also a specific place where you have this diplomatic culture, where you have this diplomatic etiquette, I don't know to which point it's always respected, but still it creates an environment where maybe that feels safer for women to work in. You're going to have less, I don't know, aggressive behaviors as you can find in, I don't know, the stock market or behind the closed doors of some private or public institutions, because it's obviously always more egalitarian in the sense that people are more isolated, they're more individualized, and they have to represent something. They have to represent their country, they have to represent their institution, their organization, the NGO, whatever. So you're never there just for the sake of your own career. You're always there as the representative of something else. Obviously, you have to behave in a more diplomatic way. Maybe that's the biggest change from the national level.
I think this is, we can go back to this after the break, because this leads to the question of how do women fit in places where there are strong clubbing and strong networks. And it's true that in international institutions, probably that is less present, and therefore women feel more equal to men in the sense that there is not, on the other hand, a cohesive club to which they have to be accepted. So that, I mean, if I may say, I feel this difference between when I was here as professor and when I am now. It's one is a more national place, this one is a more international place, and you feel it. I mean, I think I can testify to this theory in my small experience. Anyway, let's break for 15 minutes. Let's come back around 4:30, 4:35, and let's continue the discussion. And those that are connected online, please come back in about 10, 15 minutes so that we have a more general discussion across the three aspects of political, private sector, and history, and how this fits into what we have learned over time. So thanks at all, and we go back also to the questions that were posed, both by Anais, by Daniela, and Susie. Thank you, and see you in a few minutes.
Editing a video, hopefully I won't have lost what we were. Yes. I was just a bit.
ma la fibra è basta da concludere qua. Non mi dà più segnale. Campo, vedo tanto, spesso per
Okay, let's start moving back. I hope Brenna and Tom are still with us so that now we can, okay. I'm sorry, we had a sort of small technical issue here because it's very warm and somehow the big screen has decided not to work anymore. But we can still see you on our computer, so I hope you still hear us. Can you hear us, Brendan? Yeah? Okay, and Tom as well.
We hear you. Yeah.
Okay, and we hear you as well. So we go through our computers rather than the big screen in the room. That's fine. So let's start from, we heard different views. I think one of them, I don't know where to start this discussion because we have touched upon different aspects. But maybe one aspect that we can start with is the different behavior of women leaders. So this was touched by you, Costanza, also by you, Joanna. And to some extent, we can also turn to Tom and Brenna to see if they really see a difference in the way women believe when they are in leadership. And the reason why we say that is because we mentioned before that Ursula von der Leyen, for example, is a very, not only is the Commission much more pink now, but is also very, very prone to adopt measures in support of women that are not just quotas, where we had Merkel or Thatcher that maybe were different. So starting from that, what do you think, all of you, is what really affects the leadership of women? And do you see a difference in particular depending on how many women there are? So for example, Thatcher was of course much more alone in the leadership that she had at the time. Maybe now Ursula von der Leyen having 50% of women on board or almost in the Commission, she's not the only one, so she can actually act much more in a way as a female without the risk of having to be upset by men. So what is it that may affect the way in which women conduct their leadership? Why don't we start with Joanna, that maybe is more historic, and then we go to the others.
Yeah, thank you. I reflected upon what you just said before we went to have a break about the network and the isolation of women in decision-making positions. In the case of international organizations, the origin of the presence of women in important positions was the result of an internal lobbying from organizations that were outside of international organizations. So basically women's organization, women's association. And you had this from the 19th century, actually. You had International Federation Association of Women throughout the world who organized. They organized specifically during war times. And I think it's not completely irrelevant for our contemporary times, because obviously we are going through, we live through a war right now that also impacts the way we define leadership in big organizations. And these women, they integrated international organizations during wars or after the wars, because they lobbied for peace, because they had different visions on certain topics, especially peace, but later also economic development, where women and children were completely overlooked by regular men philosophies and then policies. So my point is that no women made it alone. They always arrived to some position in international organizations because they had an association, a network of women lobbying for their position behind them to support them, to push for changes within international organizations. And obviously, they knew they could rely on this, and they always represented their own organization. So that would be food for thought in this discussion, because indeed, if you have women completely isolated who are fighting on their own against men in their national context, they're not the same women. It's not the same gender than being a woman represented of a women organization, being aware that they represent something as women. When maybe Margaret Thatcher wanted to let the world forget that she was a woman because she wanted to become minister and not a women minister. And that could be a very different gender approach of the question of women in these organizations.
Brenna, Tom, would you like to say something on how you see women implement their leadership? Does it depend on the number of women? Does it depend on other factors that you may observe?
Well, I think that there's definitely a few different factors, and maybe as sort of a top line, you know, looking at this question of the case that's being made for women and why are women good in leadership. I think there are several studies from the banking industry that show, one, that when you look at the topic of ESG in terms of climate change, women in leadership perform better on the topic of climate change, for example. Another one we've heard cited quite a bit also is risk. Obviously, an extremely crucial topic for the financial industry in an incredibly volatile period and a changing macroeconomic context at the moment. But I do think also this question of, you know, individuals versus a group is certainly pertinent. I mean, I think that when you look at the context of, I at least can think of on my patch one key bank where you had a female chief risk officer that had huge issues related to risk and compliance, which caused an ongoing issue for that bank. However, that again was also not a bank that had a very diverse executive level. So, you know, you did have a woman who was a little bit on her own within that composition. And how much that affects an individual's behavior, it's hard to say on a case by case basis. But I do think that also when you look not only at the very highest level, but also going down, you know, towards more middle management, you know, in the area that I focus on because it's so important for the Swiss financial industry is wealth management. And of course, there you have the importance of client relationships. And it's long been a topic that as you see wealth transfer, both generational or also it could be spousal wealth transfer, that having a male dominated, you know, sort of set of client facing, you know, relationship managers, the way they talk to women and sort of the issues that they prioritize, there sometimes was a big disjunct where you would have a man talking to a daughter or a wife as, you know, but actually talking to the father and talking above the woman in the room. And I do personally see in terms of some of the women who have stepped into both sort of middle management positions or maybe also lower down, that you have a different quality of conversations. You have maybe more engagement with topics that are, you know, key to these people, less just sort of about profit maximization, but more on the interpersonal side. and also just being able to relate more as people. Maybe that went a little bit off topic, but I don't know, Tom, if you have some thoughts.
You answered it well. I mean, one of the problems that we have as journalists is that it's really hard for us to sort of get behind the facade and know what's really going on. So I just don't have a good answer to that question right now.
Okay, let's see if Costanza has an answer to that question.
I have proposed some points, but how does it change and when it change? You know, we talked about quota policies. They exist for politics and they now exist for company boards, non-executive positions, or thresholds for director positions. The quotas that are set are normally around 40%. And this is based on something that is called critical mass theory. And this has to do with something Elena was referring to before, meaning that it usually takes a certain minimum amount of people from the same gender, or maybe also some other common characteristics, to feel really comfortable in a room. I have experienced this myself, just coming from an international environment, going back to a very national environment, just the same way, because in the international environment, there were more women, and in the national environment, there were less. So this is about how numbers change. Then there is the role modeling effect. I fully agree with Thorsten. I mean, Southeast Asia is not a model of equality. Women there have been prime ministers because of caste system, not because of enhanced gender equality. And yet they acted a bit as role models for future generations, to the extent that you have many more women in politics there than elsewhere. Probably they're also from higher castes, but anyway, so the role modeling effect is important. And the last point I want to make is, when we talk about the decisions they adopt, doing politics, adopting decisions that are for women, spending decisions for women, or spending decisions for all, or taking specific regulatory framework. When I point to this sort of decisions and leadership style, I don't think about spending like the Women Entrepreneur Fund or social expenses, or this way of spending. It's more about implementing this kind of criteria that would help introducing an assessment on the quality implication of the expense for energy, on the expense for the green transition. And the very reason why we have this at this moment in time is that, for instance, Next Generation EU is 60%, 40% for the ecological transition and 20% for the digital transition, which are male-dominated sectors insofar as creation of employment and creation of value are involved. And this is why we now have these instruments, because most women have lost their job due to COVID, and now there is a special attention into monitoring these dimensions, not the funds for women, but how all the funds we are developing may impact the position. So it is also this special attitudes to governance that I think is a little bit characteristic of women in these positions, and at least lately.
Let me go back to actually the very first question that we had today and I had postponed, which is something that Brian and Tom started talking about earlier today, and I would like to start with them indeed in asking the question. So we talk about the importance of having women to foster a change. And then your report was focusing on the number of women as a way to measure the change. Now, the question that we had was, how would you measure change beyond the numbers? So ultimately, if we really want to change culture, rather than just having women participation for the sake of having number representation of women, how can we actually see whether having more women on the board has changed something in the way banks, in your case, work. So it's not just a matter of having women representation. It's not a matter of the bank being more or less profitable when you have a women representation or more or less risky. Do we see that, for example, women implement a change in the way men interact with each other, in the way decisions are taken, more in the social way, if you want, of thinking of women, that maybe is not, strictly speaking, more characteristic of a man. So how do we measure change beyond the number representation?
So one point maybe to the first part of the first aspect of this, the going beyond the numbers, and Tom already touched on this a bit with looking at the board and the pay and ultimately which positions are women in on the board. And we actually had another slide to add, but then realized it would be too much speaking time for the presentation, so we left it up. And it was kind of a final portion of what we did, which is that on the executive or top management level, we didn't only look at the number of women, but also looked at, okay, at all 25 of these banks, what are the roles on the top management level that you see women filling? And what we found is a lot, the highest number of roles were either human resources or some other form of a title for that, of people. Sustainability was also a top contender. And I think one of the ways that you see change is also having more women, not just in terms of the overall pool of women and how numerous are they on that level, but really what roles do they fill? Are they in roles that are very close to the organization and running of those businesses, or are they roles that are obviously important, but maybe are less central to setting the overall direction of what the company is doing, kind of the top line priorities of the divisions and the group as a whole. And what we found, which is quite positive, I think, Elena, you were mentioning also this this meeting of you had with recently with others in charge of risk from other banks, and how you saw more women in those roles. What we've actually seen, one of the most positive developments that really started around the time of when we were reporting, and we've seen it continuing, is that we've seen a lot more female chief financial officers as well. And those are really positions where you could see, okay, this is someone who's in a position that's seen as key to the organization. Could, it's not such a stretch to think a CFO becomes a CEO. And so I think beyond just looking at the numbers, you also look at, okay, who are these people and what do they do? And in terms of how that changes the culture, I think it's hard to say it exactly, because we don't have so many examples so far. We don't have so many examples where you have both, the top job is a female, and also the wider group is, of executives is majority or close to majority female. I think in Europe we are seeing, NatWest, that's the one bank that has a female CEO and a female CFO. So I would say in terms of Europe, that would be a good place to look to see how are these changes occurring. And then across the pond, but also something I've witnessed for quite a long time, is the example of Citi. So Citi, famously became the first Wall Street bank to have a female CEO. But also long before that happened, I've had quite a few dealings with, you know, high-level managers for Citi here in Switzerland, in Europe, and I have to say that long before I was dealing with women at this role at other banks, I was meeting a lot of women who were very actively engaged in this topic and running the show at Citi. So you kind of see, okay, the culture piece is important. And so it wasn't surprising to see that Citi became the first bank to have a female CEO, because it seemed ingrained in the culture. And there were, I think, differences in terms of prioritizing this topic. I'm not close enough to Citi on the executive level in the US to say how it's run differently, but it certainly would be an interesting question.
So if I understand your answer correctly, in a way, it seems as if having women impact culture at the broader level, and once you have a culture at the broader level that somehow is more female friendly, then it's also possible to have, like the case of Citi, a female in very high position, like the CEO position. So probably it's much easier to have a female CEO in a bank which already has tradition for, or at least is open to women representation, if I can sort of see your answer. Maybe as a next follow-up of your study, if you are interested in doing a follow-up, you could actually go and look more at not just the number, but indeed the various positions. So I really encourage you, for example, to look within the board, how women representation has changed. Because as I was telling you, now we have a lot of chairs of the risk committee, for example, and maybe 5 years ago, we wouldn't have had that. So maybe even when you don't see big changes in number, you may see changes in the position, which are equally important, in particular for future appointments and position of women. Let's go to Costanza now in terms again of women contribution beyond the number, and then we go to Joanna.
Yes, thank you. There is this issue of a little bit of endogeneity, no? We look at how many women produce more women in leadership positions, whereas I think that probably one way of looking at this is having one step more. So how many, I mean, whether a core number of women produces policy that equalizes a bit society, and it is this being more equal that produces more women leader. And obviously the question is the one you asked, Elena, how do we measure this interim impact? As I was mentioning during my presentation, the available economic and political science research that is there is very limited. And it looks mainly at policy preferences and preferences in terms of variations in budget spending, comparison with men about spending during electoral cycles, for instance. And yes, and there is something just very little about economic growth. It's more difficult to measure the impact on making society more equal, but there I think is really where we should look at in present and future research. Given that now we are paying more attention about the number of women in private companies and in decision making, and especially given that it has now been, so let's see, quotas in politics have been adopted first around the year 2000 in France. So we have 22 years of experience, and then all the other countries have been following basically. And in company boards, the first adoption of this policy is 2011, always France and Italy, and now we have it at the European level. I think there, I mean, we have some points of reference out of which we can start measuring impact. And obviously, and I'm sorry here to repeat myself, but now that we have this monitoring instruments in terms of requiring, for instance, that member state collect disaggregated data on male and females as final beneficiaries of public policy, it's going to be easier to collect data on the impact of policy adopted by a woman-led commission or a specific department of a commissioner led by a woman, or by a specific government, and even city councils. I mean, there is a tradition of city councils doing gender budgeting, so there we can also have a time series. But it's to a large extent a question of data. And I think we now start thinking about how to make data more easily available. Mind, there isn't yet an obligation, I don't know why, from the European level, because I think there are some legal issues that I cannot see, but there is a strong recommendation into collecting gender disaggregated data on all the kind of policies that are being adopted. So maybe that's a way.
Sorry, Costanza, one issue that you keep saying, but I'm not so sure I understood it. There are quotas in politics. Sure. But for which position in politics?
Can I share the screen once again? It's very short. So actually, I think you can see it now. Actually, politics is the first and only other place, I think, in a like domain of activity where there are quotas. They are different from quotas for companies. Where are they? They are legislated in many countries for electoral lists. So in most of Europe, or really most of Europe, at almost every level of election, from European Parliament election to local council elections, political parties are under the obligation of alternating candidates, having at least 40% women in their electoral lists, or as candidates in majoritarian districts. Now it changes whether you are a PR system or a majoritarian system. Wherever there aren't legislated quotas for election, but still, I mean, here is all the yellow that you can see around, and this is maybe from 2 years ago, so it has increased. You have political party quotas, meaning that the parties, there is a legislation on the parties to have in their management boards an equal number of men and women. So it's equal opportunity policy. And in this way, it's different from the women on board policy, which exists in politics. It mainly exists, it's called reserved seats. And you can see it in Africa and in some Arab countries, is a quota of result, meaning that the parliament is going to be composed 40% by the least represented gender and 60% by the other gender. This is how the legislation on boards, company boards, is currently organized. You need to have at least 40% non-executive director. In politics, it's on the candidates more generally, and only rarely on the outcome in terms of members of parliament. It only mainly applies to parliaments. There isn't, in Europe, there are fewer obligations placed on executives. They exist. So for instance, in France and Spain, they exist. They exist in Italy, and they exist in Italy for local city council. Our present Secretary General at the European University Institute is one of the very few cases of persons who have been named city councillors, but then had to be changed because the city council did not respect the gender balance, which is 40% for cities with more than 15,000 inhabitants. So different kind of things, but there is a lot of obligations.
Okay, let's move to Joanna. So going back to this question, how do you measure the contribution of women beyond the number, or women representation beyond the number? What would you say?
Just first, I wanted to reflect on 2 points that have been addressed here about Citibank, for example, and the culture, the business culture of a company that allows for more women to participate. From what I remember from this specific company in the 70s and in the 80s, it was not about including women yet. But I remember with one of the former CEO, Walter Wriston, who declared a lot at that time that his bank wanted to actually hire guys who were not from the old boys club bank culture, because he considered that bankers who were sons of bankers and sons of bankers, they would not be very good workers because they would always leave the office at 3 to be on the golf court. So he wanted young bankers who had a lot of debts to pay from the studies so that they would actually stick to the job. They would really depend on their manager because they were afraid of losing the job, and they would be willing to stay at work until midnight because they had no golf court to join. And so it's a bit anecdotal, but just to mention the fact that this company always had this meritocratic sense of they wanted to have people who worked like crazy for their job and not people from the old boys banking culture. And maybe this is specifically this kind of environment that welcome women more, because if you come with your diplomas and your will to work, then there's no reason that you don't have the job. In terms of cultural shift, I think it's important. And you mentioned, Constanza, earlier, the idea of meritocracy, and a world that is more diverse actually is more meritocratic, but also more competitive. So it's interesting from a business point of view to have more competitive workers, I guess. And unrelated, but we mentioned gender disaggregated data. And what I see in international organizations is that there is a constant debate about the fact that women are invisibilized in the data. So for a very long time, be that women who work for the international organization or women who are concerned by international organizations' policy, in both cases, women's organizations tend to lobby for and advocate for the presence of women in data, because the data doesn't take into account their reality. And this might be, to go back to the question of how do you measure change beyond numbers? The numbers are not just the presence of women. There are also the kind of questions you ask, the kind of data you want to collect, the kind of definition you give to the work you're doing. I think it's very clear in international organizations because the same concept constantly evolve throughout time. So development doesn't mean the same thing now that it meant in the 60s. Economics in general doesn't mean the same thing. Finance doesn't mean the same thing. And partly because you have different people discussing these questions. So it's not just the numbers, it's also what numbers designate. So indeed, if you say you have more women in that group, it depends on what job they're doing, because if they're all secretaries, we don't care about parity and equality in terms of numbers. This is why the gender inclusion in decision-making position is important. But it's also about how do you hierarchize the questions, and where do women contribute to the change of hierarchization of this question? So if you just take the example of development, I think we see in international organizations the fact that the definition of development started to include more and more social aspects throughout time. And the result of this, or the origin of this, was that more and more women pointed out that you can't evaluate the development level of a country just based on, I don't know, growth in GDP. You have to take into account so many different aspects, especially because you want to evaluate development on the long run. So you have to look at children health and education and women education, et cetera, et cetera. These changes, you can't just evaluate them from one year to another, which sometimes is the problem with the evaluation of policy. You want to have immediate results. So you implement a policy, and the year after you look at the results. Sometimes the results come out 20 years after. But on the long run, I think this is exactly what history is showing us in international organizations.
This is actually very interesting. Let me come back to one of the questions that I attributed to Nais before, but actually it's not Nais, but it's an anonymous question from the audience. So maybe the question is a bit, I wouldn't want to use the word provocative, but it's a little bit about how women behave and what they talk about, which is a little bit what you touch upon, Joanna. So the question says, what would you make of powerful female politicians? So maybe this time we start with Costanza, such as Mrs. Thatcher or Mrs. Gandhi, who were still reported to discuss about their grandchildren, women questions, and so on, instead of sticking to their leadership in economics, finance, or international affairs. Is it a way to assert that women should definitely stand away from males' matter? And I mean, the same can be taken, for example, I always notice Christine Lagarde, that always talks about other topics sometimes, and not just monetary policy or strictly speaking ECB. And I have the impression, but maybe I'm wrong, as a non-scholar of the subject, that this is not necessarily taken favorably. But could you maybe help in answering? Can you see the question?
Yes, I was looking at it again. First of all, general consideration. So I was saying before that in this idea that having more women in power, which is a goal per se, and we agree, I mean, it's a matter of democratic sustainability or democracy. In this idea that having more women in power, we have also the effect of having a different leadership because we bring some difference. There is a lot of gender constructed roles behind, and yet every leader is different. So I was taking the example of Thatcher and Merkel, who certainly are not women who talk about women issues and are women who have normally conformed, in spite of colors of their clothes, to a way of doing that was already, I mean, very conventional within the political sphere. In terms of the campaigns report, and this is interesting for Reuters, and the electoral coverage and how media talk about women, that tend to emphasize that the attention of the media, and therefore of the public, consequently, is very, very frequently drawn to whenever women talk about personal affairs, how they're dressed, what their family is about, and etc. So we shouldn't take it for granted that they speak more about these things. There is really a lot more coverage about these things rather than the policy content of what they say. I mean, I really, two examples, Jacinta Ardern and Kamala Harris. I know what color they were dressed the day when they were proclaimed, because the entire world press was talking about the fact that Kamala was white and that Jacinta was red. And these were weeks apart, but the reporting was all about that, as it is about who are the members to the family members, etc. So, you know, I mean, I don't think there is a specific tendency of women or certain women, but certainly, given once again the gender roles we perform, there is an attention of the media, of the press, and of the electorate looking at whenever they don't talk about policy content, whereas their policy content talk is generally downplayed.
I could add also, when they cry, then is, you know, I don't know what, if a man cries, nothing happens. Brenna, Tom, how do you see that? Do you agree that there is much more attention to women when they don't talk about, strictly speaking, their work, and this doesn't do anything less than reinforcing gender stereotype and certainly not supporting gender equality?
I could say, just like so I do listen to the press conferences with Ms. Lagarde fairly regularly, and I've listened to predecessors in the past, and it does stand out that sometimes she strays a bit from central banking, and it's really interesting what to make of it. One thing